For some time, the TDU has been using its national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The objective of these conversations is to ensure that the public is informed of critical information on and analysis of the economy in a timely manner. By 2019, as many as 5 million Venezuelan migrants had fled political and socioeconomic turmoil in their home country. This mass exodus has been labeled as the second worst refugee crisis in the world. As such, many Venezuelans have settled in neighboring countries, with Colombia hosting and subsequently regularizing almost 2 million migrants. In Trinidad and Tobago, there are an estimated 50,000 Venezuelan migrants, of which roughly 16,000 have been temporarily regularized by our government. The provision of services to the Venezuelan migrants comes at a cost, particularly in the short term. However, their integration into the local labor market is likely to increase government revenues in the medium to long term. This is due to migrant-related increases in both economic output and consumption. But what more do the data show? What are the fiscal implications of the Venezuelan immigration for Trinidad and Tobago? To answer these questions and more, we turn to our panel of experts. On this evening's panel, we have Dr. Roger Hussein, Senior Economist at the University of the West Indies and the coordinator of the TDU, Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, retired Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, and Dr. Buendodat Tiwari, the former Minister of Planning and both the former Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Now, just a couple meeting announcements. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you are not speaking. And please note that this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. This evening's conversation will proceed as follows. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. Hussein, followed by contributions from Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Tiwari. Last but not least, we'll invite questions and comments from you, our audience, either verbally or using the Zoom chat box. Thank you. Dr. Hussein?
Right, so Christian, good evening, and good evening, everyone. Are you all hearing me correctly, clearly, Christian?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. So this is an important juncture in the series of conversations we have had on the Venezuelan immigrants. As Christian and everyone else would have known, we have been hosting these seminars since November 2020, and we have to continue. We are now at a point where we could give a sort of overview comment at the impact of the Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago. What we would say is at this point, there are still many gaps to be closed, still a lot of information asymmetry. The focus by the regulatory and other NGO bodies is not really on information collection, so that it's a struggle. However, having said that, some of the people on this seminar this evening, we have worked together in different ways, and we have pulled a mass of information together that we hope can educate the public in Trinidad and Tobago and may be of use in time to policymakers in Trinidad and Tobago in helping to take the next few steps forward in the whole scenario of managing the contribution of the Venezuelans to the Trinidad and Tobago economy, whilst at the same time facilitating their stay here in our country. Structure of the presentation is as follows, and I'll move right into it. Now, one of the fascinating things about the Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago is that they represent an important demographic dividend. So if you were to look at the Trinidad and Tobago population, you would see the proportion of the Trinidad and Tobago population less than 20 years is 8%, whereas only 1.75% of the Venezuelan population is less than 20 years. At the other end, in terms of the proportion of the Venezuelan population over 45 years, it's only 13.5%, whilst a significant amount of the Trinidad and Tobago population is over 45 years. What you find is there is a great majority of the Venezuelans between 20 years and 45 years, and that represents a potential demographic dividend if properly managed for the Trinidad and Tobago economy. And policymakers have to lock on to this, because ours is a peculiar economy with an aging population, a very bad fiscal situation, and an economy that is stagnant. So, you know, you have to pull back from all of this and ask yourself, let us assume the amount of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago is 60,000 people. You have to pull back from all of this and ask yourself, how can 60,000 Venezuelans on our shore be embraced and engaged in a symbiotic way that helps to reduce the fiscal burden in the country, regenerate or create economic growth, because we have not had that for a while, and at the same point in time, help to deal with the aging population of Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the things we have done over the last 6 to 8 months is educate the public on some of these steps that could be taken in that regard. Now, this diagram here, it was presented before, represents to me the most important macroeconomic diagram confronting the Trinidad and Tobago economy. It's a general equilibrium diagram. It shows that the initial point of operation of the Trinidad and Tobago economy is at a point such as A, producing NT0 non-tradable goods and T0 tradable goods. And when the COVID-19 situation came to the Trinidad and Tobago economy, we were forced last year in March to shut down parts of the economy, and we drifted from A to a point such as B. One of the things that really captures my attention is the way we are opening up the economy. So we are opening up the economy, and we have to be careful because we are opening up to what? And opening up back to what point? If we go back to point A to me was a very worrisome position. Christian, so I will just do a check at this point and make sure you are hearing me.
Yes, Dr. Hussein, loud and clear.
Right. Thank you. And point A to me is a very worrying position in that it represents a labor force participation rate that is contracting, a debt level that is rising, an economic growth process that is contracting, a non-energy export position that is contracting, a corruption perception index that is not where it should be, and an ease of doing business index that is sliding. I don't think that A was a desirable point. I looked at the COVID situation, and I look at it still as a great chance to reset and recalibrate the Trinidad and Tobago economy from the extremely poor economic structure that 20 years of natural gas production since Atlantic LNG Train 1 forced onto the economy by virtue of the Dutch disease. And therefore, I would have thought that all efforts and all policy making ideas would have been drifting the economy away from options such as A and C towards an option such as D, which is an extremely greater focus on the production of tradable goods. And more than tradable goods, I will say the production of non-energy export-oriented goods. That's where I think policymakers should be heavily driving the Trinidad and Tobago economy. That's where I think a lot of thought should be put into the economy. And when I see, in my mind, we are drifting closer to C than to a point such as D, it worries me and it has me concerned. And I am of the opinion that the Venezuelan immigrants, and I saw Mr. Gary Griffith refer to 120,000 illegal Venezuelan immigrants in May. I am going to assume 60,000 throughout this conversation, so my numbers would always be conservative. I think 60,000 Venezuelan immigrants here should be able to put us from A back onto a point such as D, which is win-win for the Trinidad and Tobago economy, and of course, moves us onto a higher indifference curve. or a higher level of welfare. And so, in thinking through where we have to go, I think, as I said, this general equilibrium diagram should be the overarching framework guiding macroeconomic thought. I read the economic recovery document, and I think, this is my reading of it, seems to be taking us towards the point C. And I am not sure that is correct. In fact, I think that is wrong, because point C is associated with a worsening of the current account balance. And that's something we should be encouraging at this point in time, especially given that our stock of reserves, it has contracted significantly in the last few years. In terms of the fiscal impact of immigrants, we are just making an overview estimation here. It would take much more detailed information to provide a significantly more accurate number. This is just almost a back of the envelope type of calculation to give policymakers some type of guiding framework of a basic methodology. There are three main phases in the migrant life cycle. The time the migrant arrives in Trinidad and Tobago, which in turn, of course, would condition the point in which they could start to work. Of course, their age at which they arrive. If they come here and some of them are housewives or they are sick, whether or not they are part of the labor market and they are participating. Our labor force participation rate in the Trinidad and Tobago economy is abysmal. It's about 54% as we speak. And it has contracted from 63% around 2006. And I compare it with 72% in the Bahamas, we have a long way to go. And if policymakers in Trinidad and Tobago could find a way, using the Venezuelan labor force in part and otherwise, to bring our labor force participation rate up to 72%, equivalent to that of the Bahamas, so 65%, equivalent to that of the Caribbean average, that alone represents a massive increase in GDP and something which we certainly would be able to work out if required. And then we also have the retirement age of the immigrant, which would tell us about certain type of privileges and benefits he or she may have to get. If the migrant enters the country and starts to work immediately, then even if they only buy doubles and various things like that, we get implicitly, we get some value added tax at some point. So when the migrant starts to work, is important. Now, they also use up resources in the economy in terms of, in terms of they use up national security, they use up health care, and they use up a basic amount of registration time. So we have to take those costs seriously into consideration when we pool one number in terms of the expenditure side, and when we look at the revenue side, we have to look at some other factors. There are two sets of factors which play an influential role in determining the net fiscal impact of immigration. This is a part, of course, from what stage the immigrant is at in the life cycle of contribution. And these are the migrant characteristics themselves and the host country characteristics. If the migrants are ineligible to work, then that would obviously adversely affect their fiscal contribution, be it whether their fiscal contribution is from a direct means or indirect means like value-added tax. Now, this is where the registration of the migrants comes into play. If we have 16,500 migrants registered, out of the number I'm using is 60,000, then only about a quarter of the migrants are registered. And that, to me, folks, makes no sense. I think we should register all the migrants in Trinidad and Tobago and increase the probability that they would be unafraid to work and increase the probability that they would be able to work in the formal sector as compared to the informal sector, and increase the probability that they would work in the export-oriented or import-substituting sector as compared to the non-tradable sector. And these are the probabilities that really matter moving forward, because if we get it wrong in terms of the number of people registered as a proportion of the total number of migrants here, then that would have fiscal implications and perhaps more importantly, implications for the current account balance. And that's the aspect that also really bothers me. The current account balance in Trinidad and Tobago needs a boost. And if we, for endogenous reasons, do not register all the Venezuelans, then we will be making steps in the wrong direction. Also, the tax system is heavily focused on the formal sector of the economy, and the migrants are mainly working in the informal sector. That in turn would affect the amount of revenues we collect. Now, there are two techniques in the literature for calculating the fiscal impact of immigrants. One is the static and one is the dynamic. The static approach, the majority of the literature focuses on the static approach. It takes a particular year and it compares the sum of the taxes paid by the immigrants to the benefits received by them. The dynamic approach in turn captures, it focuses on the immigrant life cycle. So it takes a longer way view. It treats with children in a particular way, and these models rely heavily on the type of assumptions made about the future. We are broadly speaking here using a rough version of the static method. In the static method, the way public goods are treated and migrant children are treated obviously would affect the net fiscal outcomes. So you have two types of public goods. They are pure public goods and congestible public goods. Pure public goods are non-rivalrous. Example, national security. So that even if some more migrants come, it does not really affect the cost of providing national security. But with congestible public goods, if it is you have some Venezuelans coming here, as you see a lot, certainly I see in the Gasparilla area, a lot of pregnant Venezuelan women or Venezuelan women with the children. If it is they use up a significant amount of healthcare and healthcare time, then maybe at some point in time, the state would have to increase the healthcare budget in order to cater for the greater increase of some aspects of the healthcare sector by the Venezuelans. Now, another major difference with the static and dynamic model is how children are considered. This is just mentioned here for completeness. You know, in the long way view, after 18 years or after 20 years, the children of immigrants would be able to make a significant contribution back to the fiscal system which they benefited from for the first X years. We don't have data anywhere near that. So, but we are mentioning it here for completeness. Then there is also the type of immigrants. Kristen, I'm just doing a check again to make sure you all are hearing me.
Yes, loud and clear.
If the immigrants are highly educated, Christian, that's good. We could shift the supply capacity of the economy rightwards, and we could shift it rightwards in a way that can increase production of certain type of goods. I mean, most economies try to increase the production of technology-intensive goods. They try to increase the production of export-oriented goods. And so I ask the audience here today, how much of our immigrants are highly skilled? How much of our immigrants, what are the knowledge attributes that we know about our immigrants, Venezuelan immigrants here in Trinidad and Tobago? And what I would say is we know very little. And I would ask why. And I would also answer why. We know very little because we have not registered all the Venezuelans. So it remains a struggle in the corridors of policy making that we are almost guessing. Now the data tracking matrix of the IOM provides some indicative evidence, and that's the best I've seen, and we have to go with that. But I don't understand, and I do not agree with a policy in which we hear the Commissioner of Police, who was a former National Security Minister, use a number like 120,000 illegal Venezuelan immigrants here, if I remember correctly. And then we only have 16,525, I believe, registered. And we are comfortable with that. I am very uncomfortable with that because the registration process is one that could allow us to determine various demographic attributes and socioeconomic attributes of the immigrant to help us with the planning process. Now, it's not to say that unskilled immigrant labor is not useful. In fact, it's very useful, especially in a country in which you have a scarcity of unskilled labor. But there is a danger lurking within this here. And the danger is that, so it's something linked to what I call the Wyszynski theorem from international trade theory. If you have a language barrier and you have unregistered immigrants, then their skills, because of the language barrier and because of their unregistered or undocumented status, makes them only or mainly eligible to work in the non-tradable informal part of the economy. And if these 45,000 unregistered or so illegal immigrants end up in the informal, non-tradable part of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, that is the worst possible outcome for Trinidad and Tobago. I submit that is the outcome that we need to reverse, and one methodology by which we could reverse that is to register all the migrants, and I am fully aware of the COVID restrictions and how difficult it is, but we register all the migrants and we use the associated data to help us with planning and making more intelligent, information-rich decisions. Now, the literature has quite a few studies that focus on the fiscal impact of immigrants, some from the USA, and you see that the fiscal cost is 0.35% of GDP. So another author, Lee, found 0.4% of GDP. There are a vast number of fiscal impact of immigration studies in the developed world, and they are generally less than 1%. Not only in the developed world, there is a benchmark study by the OECD and ILO 2018, and anybody interested in these type of studies should look at this. And that benchmark study shows that the overall net fiscal impact of immigrants is generally less than 1%. So in general, team, we don't experience in the world, in the global economy, a huge fiscal impact from the immigrant population. And the developing world is not really different. In some countries, it's negative, in some countries, positive, but generally less than 1% on either side. So for this study, we focused on some spending axes that was used by Raina in Colombia. And I'm grateful to one of my research assistants, Amrita Dev, who pulled together this material and translated it from Spanish into English to work on. And the spending axes used in Colombia is attention to early childhood, preschool, basic and secondary education and complementary services, higher education, and so on. And the percentage cost using an upper bound scenario and a lower bound scenario for Colombia was also very small. So the precedence and the experience in other countries is that the fiscal impact of immigration generally does not cross 1%. Now, I went through the permutations for the areas in which Venezuelans have a fiscal impact in Trinidad and Tobago. Some sectors have been excluded, like education, because we didn't open up in that regard. And that, before I move on, I would want to say that having Venezuelan children here, some of them here for 2 years, and we are not educating them, could turn out to be such an explosive social situation later on, with a social cost that by far exceeds in my judgment, the cost of educating them or including them in some type of educational program, that we would want to probably pay some more attention to that. So I summarized here some of the basic calculation, and I'm grateful to Professor Anthony Gonzalez. I was reading something that he sent to me. He picked up an error that I made and I cleaned it up here in these numbers. The total healthcare cost in Trinidad and Tobago is 5.69 billion in terms of the budgeted cost. The registration cost of the immigrants, we put out 5 million TT, and the national security cost in terms of the budget is 6.12 billion. When we work out the per unit version of these things and I proportion them to the 60,000 Venezuelans accordingly, and if we assume that this is the key assumption here, that every Venezuelan pays an indirectly amount of value added tax similar to in per capita to Trinidad and Tobago national, then the net fiscal cost of the Venezuelan in Trinidad and Tobago is 470.1 million, or minus 3.01% of 8% of GDP. Now, So it's not overbearing, but remember these are static numbers and we are not doing a dynamic approach. And also many sectors of our economy are not open up for assistance to the Venezuelans in terms of the official structure that we have adopted. So where does all of this leave us now? It leaves us in a place where I think it would be irresponsible, having spent quite a bit of time looking at this whole immigration situation, for us not to recommend that all the Venezuelans be registered. And I submit, and I am of the view, having looked at the literature and having spent some time thinking about this, that registering all the Venezuelans would increase the probability that they can work in the non-energy export sector. And that to me is where the greatest benefits of interacting with this Venezuelan workforce lies for the Trinidad and Tobago economy. A boom in potential labor that could help increase non-energy export sector output. In an economy where the stock of reserves is declining and the labor force participation rate is falling. And I hope that you all make note of that. Registering the Venezuelan reduces the likelihood that they will work in the non-tradable sector. And I know that employment in the non-tradable sector has a direct relationship with import of non-tradable goods. So if you work, for example, in a bar, and you sell Johnny Walker red and blue and green and whatever you have, then we have to import that. If you work in a gyro stall and you have to import lamb, I think they call it lamb kebab, I'm not sure what they call it, but you have to import this lamb that is on this stick, this piece of steel rod that you cut out and it's whatnot, then that's imported. If you work selling rubber slippers or beef patties, a significant amount of the things that goes into that vending process is imported. And so there is a direct relationship, and I showed it earlier on in these seminar series between the non-tradable sector employment and the imports of non-tradable goods. And in fact, I can remember that the correlation is 84%. Policymakers should consider increasing the time period in which the registered Venezuelan workers can legally work in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm suggested until next year, December at a minimum. This allows, Christian, the ability to plan. It allows these workers to take a different strategic view. Rather than just quick win hustle money, they could now try to develop a career for a period of time and make an investment in themselves and learning to weld and learning carpentry. Rather than think, well, I only have 3 more months remaining out of the 6 months. Let me go and sell some gyro and make a hustle. Let me go in a bar and see if I can pick up 2 boyfriends. And I'm just using colloquial language. Let me see where is the quickest buck for my dollar, for my investment. If you give them a more established time period, and in the context of the COVID, I understand it's difficult, but we are opening up now, then they can plan and they could probably better deploy their skills, and they could probably look for the sectors that greater align with their natural skills. And that would be down to the benefit of the production possibility frontier. And finally, I read some of the work by Dr. Tiwari, and it was very eye-opening. And we should be looking for fiscal assistance because we have one of the highest per capita inflow of Venezuelans from this country that is so affected by in different ways that their people are migrating. We have perhaps the highest per capita inflow in the Western Hemisphere, and I'm sure Professor Gonzalez and Dr. Tiwari would be able to elaborate on that more. So I've taken almost half an hour. I just wanted to locate what we are doing. Yes, it's a back of the envelope calculation. We submitted that. It's just providing some directive, but it shows that as it stands in the context of the existing scenario with no formal revenue inflow except from value-added tax from the Venezuelans, that of course the overall fiscal impact is negative. It stresses on other things like registering the Venezuelan immigrants and the sectors in which they may be able to generate much more value added for the Trinidad and Tobago economy. And I will stop there and allow the other commentators to have their say before we take some questions. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Hussein. I think it was very thorough and well-informed. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Gonzalez to give his contribution. Professor Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian, and a pleasant good evening to all my colleagues, fellow panelists, and of course, all the attendees. Let me first of all thank Roger for this presentation and the piece of work he has done on this. In reviewing the literature to prepare my presentation, I discovered that there was very, very little work done in this area in developing countries. There's a recent study by the Overseas Development Institute, I believe of Sussex University, and they lament in a way the paucity of work done in developing countries on this fiscal question with respect to migration. Let me say that it is very important for us to try to understand the fiscal impact, because there's a general view that migrants are a drag on the welfare system, and they're also a drain on the treasury. And I think in some way we need to have a proper discussion of that and try to see to what extent it is true or it is not true, or what factors make it true or what factors do not make it true. So it's in this context I tend to see the work that Roger has been doing, and I would just like to make some comments to try to further the discussion. Now, the aim here is really to try to discover what is the net fiscal impact of the presence of migrants in our country. And one is really trying to see the contribution that migrants make to the treasury, that is in terms of taxes, as against what they receive in terms of benefits from the welfare system or from the state. So as a result, one is trying to measure what the government spends on migrants as against what they contribute to the national revenue. It's a very difficult task, in many ways very complex, and Roger has mentioned this, and we can all see why it is difficult. There are several effects here, very difficult to capture. There are data problems. There's the indirect effects where it's very, very difficult to assess them because it's very difficult to get the information necessary to really assess these things. But I would say that certainly I agree with Roger that one has to start with a static analysis. At this point in time, it's not possible to do any serious dynamic analysis over any kind of long-term period, because first of all, we have, this is a pretty recent phenomenon. It's just in the last 3 years that we have begun to see this kind of surge in Venezuelan migration. And to do a long-term analysis, one needs to be able to make some assumption about the life cycle of these immigrants over a certain period of time, let's say about 10 years. We need to be able to assess them in the stage of arrival, in a stage later on when they are settled in the country with children and so forth, and they're working and very productive, and again, finally, when they retire. So at this point in time, it's very difficult to make assumptions about these things. So the best we can do at this now is really to try to do a kind of static impact analysis, which is to look at the data for 1 year, the historical data, and try to see to what extent they may be paid more taxes as compared to the benefits that they are getting. I think this is what Roger attempted to do here in order to try to promote the discussion. So as I said, I accept that as the approach. I would say, however, that we are dealing with a migration that is, in my view, largely forced, in that you have basically two types of migration. You have voluntary and involuntary. In the case of Venezuela, migration is largely involuntary. That is to say, people are fleeing because they are forced to flee. They have serious problems. There are economic problems, in some cases political problems, and as a result, they see the need to go abroad. This is quite different from voluntary migration, where people decide, over a length of time, a year, 2 years, that they want to migrate because they're not happy where they are and that they can do better elsewhere, and they take time to make that kind of decision. So when they go abroad, they come with the intention of settling. In our case here, we tend to see, as already you can see, for instance, where people are coming and they're also returning, they're going back and forth and so forth. So in that kind of context, it is difficult to assess properly the impact or the fiscal impact of that kind of migration. It is still very much in a process of evolution, and we have to really study it more to try to get some kind of firmer data as to where it is going. Now, in reviewing the literature, we see the tendency to look at both developed and developing countries. By and large, the analysts tend to believe that there's very little difference between the results for developed and developing countries. Of course, there are differences in the structure. For instance, in developing countries, the tax collection systems are pretty poor, and their welfare systems are also not as elaborate as in most developed countries. So you have that differences between them. Yes, when you do studies, you tend to find that more or less the results come out the same. You would find that, I think as Roger pointed out, there's about plus or minus 1% of GDP where the net result tends to fall, and that it's pretty minimal in terms of the impact, and it's very difficult to draw an overall conclusion. What, however, seems clear is that each case has to be looked at in a very specific way. That is, each context is very different. And here I would say, for instance, that Trinidad and Tobago does not easily fit into a low-income developing country, a low-income or even a middle-income developing country. Trinidad and Tobago has a pretty high public sector. It's probably about 35–40% of the GDP, as compared to most low-income countries or most middle-income countries. The public sector doesn't go more than about 15–20% of GDP. So Trinidad is a bit different here. Also, Trinidad has a high degree of social spending. We have a welfare system here that covers education, social security, health, and so forth, that along with quite a wide range of subsidies, which is pretty elaborate for most developing countries. I would think that kind of social spending is very different from what most economists would analyze when they're doing this, looking at this type of problem. So we need to take into account these specifics when we're looking at this kind of work, and try to understand basically how these differences would impact on the results. We are in some ways quite similar in terms of, let's say, tax collection. There's a fair amount of tax collection inefficiency here, particularly in respect to the informal sector, where there are lots of Venezuelans, and that to some extent we may resemble a developing country, but we may also differ in certain respects. Now, Roger mentioned that he used the methodology by Reiner that he applied to Colombia, and Reiner started basically by taking the household surveys that Colombia did, and he was able, on the basis of those surveys, to establish a minimum and a maximum limit. That is to say, he drew out of it, identified the households, a minimum amount of households and a maximum amount of households. Now in Colombia, you can do that because there's a system. We are still to arrive at that kind of system where you can identify each household. And you can know in this household, the level of poverty is like this. This is where the people are from, and you can, in a way, do that kind of estimation. Now, in our case, we do not have that kind of data, as Roger was pointed out. We have, in a sense, to look at a different set of numbers, and I think in this case, Roger seems to be using the numbers that he got from the registration process, the 16,000, which he considered to be the minimal figure, and the number that he estimated to be about 60,000, which he considered to be the maximum figure. So those are the figures he used to sort of represent what Reiner would call his minimum and his maximum limit. As you can see, there's a lot of imprecision here because we're still not sure exactly, what the 60,000 represents. But we have to assume something in order to make some kind of progress in this discussion. Now, looking at the way in which one approaches this question of estimating expenditure as well as taxes, I think here we have to be careful about the assumptions that we are making, because that could seriously affect the kind of results that we get. Roger uses 3 expenditure axes. That is national security, what he calls, the second one is humanitarian, and the third one is healthcare. National security is considered to be an area where government spending is pretty high. And he did, in fact, estimate an average cost per citizen, average cost per capita in Trinidad, which I think was about $4,298 for the average Trinidadian. And he multiplied that by 60,000 migrants to arrive at a cost of 257 million of additional costs for security for the 60-odd Venezuelans that are here. Now, that's a kind of approach that people take. I am not clear exactly how it works because in my view, national security, this kind of estimation would more or less require a kind of some view of the marginal cost rather than the average cost. National security, in my view, is largely based on critical mass. And if you have a population of 1 million, you require a fixed cost of a certain level, and then the variable cost would change. And that it goes in that kind of lump sum way. So I'm not sure how well suited the average cost is, but I understand why he went that particular route, and I understand also too that there's an increased national cost associated with more migrants in the country. There's more policing. We can just see it when we look out there and we see the amount of the effort we have to put out in terms of policing migrants and understand, all the problems associated with it and so forth. There is some kind of additional security cost. Whether we can take it as the average cost for each citizen of Trinidad and Tobago is a different matter, I would suggest. And so depending on how we take it, if we take it as the average cost, it can affect the overall results. If it's a marginal cost, it would be much less, as we can see. Now he moves on to include the registration cost, which is pretty minor. That was about 5 million TT dollars. If we points out, if we double it to the 60 million, that cost, because of economies of scale, could come down to about 10 million TT dollars. That's a minor cost, and of course the registration cost, the third cost, the healthcare cost, is a very, very fundamental one. Now, here is where one begins to see the problems in doing this kind of estimation. Roger, I believe, estimated about 50 million for the healthcare costs. I think he pointed out that the average Venezuelan spends about, receives about 80% of what the average Trinidadian gets, or what we spend on the average Trinidadian. The Venezuelan gets about 20% of that the Venezuelan gets. So that if we spend 4,000, I think he estimated of it, just over 4,000 on average per Trinidadian, then roughly the Venezuelan would get about 800 TT dollars. And we got that estimate from talking to a number of physicians who had some idea of, in dealing with Venezuelans, what the cost is to them. So on that basis, he calculated at $50 million, and he pointed out where these largely deal with illnesses relating to child health services, immunization, reproductive health services, and short-term illness. Now, again, we're in rough territory, we're in a very complex world, because I think Dr. Lyons was on this, did one of these programs with us some time ago, and she had pointed out where the NCDs, that is, problems relating to heart and problems related to diabetes and hypertension and so forth, which afflict the population in the Caribbean very much. These problems are very similar to what pertains in Venezuela. So she would expect that the Venezuelan population here would also have suffer from those problems. And what she was pointing out is that the care the healthcare in this area is particularly very costly. She didn't give a precise estimate of what it would cost, but she suspects that if we have to treat Venezuelans here for these things, it would be very, very costly. And our health system is, to some extent, already very, very burdened. I mean, we spend a lot on healthcare in this country, and that is a very costly phenomenon. Now, I tried looking to see basically what the healthcare costs of migrants in other countries. I wasn't able to really complete that exercise, but it's a very interesting area to go into to really see what is the cost of the healthcare services. I tend to feel Roger's estimate might be a little conservative, 50 million, because this is a pretty costly area. Roger, of course, didn't go into the question of education. He pointed out that we didn't deal with education of children. Up to some months ago, I was looking at some figures, and we started dealing with this problem by allowing registered Venezuelan children to go to schools, and it's those who want to go to English schools that we have here. And then you had the UN coming in and opening up, providing some funds to open private schools for Venezuelan children. And you did cover, I had a figure in mind some weeks ago, but you did cover a certain percentage of the Venezuelan public, number of children. It was not the total population, but there was some coverage. I think probably about 50% at least, I think you covered with that particular effort. So that it's very important to bear that in mind. That's a cost. That's in most countries where there are migrants, the children's education is a significant cost in terms of what the state has to bear for migrants. So I would tend to think this is something we need to keep to bear in mind in terms of revisiting this exercise and trying to get some kind of figure as to what the real cost is. Well, basically, this was the overall estimate of, or the approach to estimating the cost. And I think that roughly came up to about 300 odd. I had a figure somewhere, I think the cost that we were spending on Venezuelans was roughly about 320 million. And then we went on to look at the taxes that we collected from them. We basically focused on the VAT tax. I think the assumption here was that most of them working in the informal sector, they probably don't pay taxes. Difficult to collect taxes there, but at least with VAT, they pay it. And he got some estimate of the average VAT that the Trinidad and Tobago citizen pays. And on that basis, he calculated again the overall taxes that are paid by Venezuelans. I think on that basis, he came up with a figure of roughly about 294 million. And this, of course, doesn't take into account what taxes they may pay in the formal sector. Let me say that if I remember carefully from one of the IOM studies, there were roughly about 35% or 40% of them working in the formal sector. That is to say, the large bulk of them are in the informal sector, but there's a certain number in the formal sector. So they would have to pay taxes there. And their employees probably also make some sort of NIS contribution for them as well. So that is not really included here in the analysis. But looking overall at what has been done, we can see that there's a net effect where they're paying less according to this estimate. They're paying less than what they're receiving. They're receiving a slight net advantage, so that we would say that the Venezuelans are making a net negative contribution. So it's relatively small as he has estimated it. My feeling is that it may be much larger than this. And why I'm saying this is because of the assumptions that I am working with. I think in the first place, we have a budgetary deficit in this country that has been running for a number of years. And in a situation of a budgetary deficit, we all are negative net contributors. The homegrown, the native people here are net negative contributions when you're running a budget deficit. Last year, the budget deficit was about $14 billion. So we all are now negatively contributing towards the the running of the state. And I would suspect that if you compare Venezuelans, I can't see how that situation could be any better. It has to be relatively worse. So some comparison with local Trinidadians in terms of contribution in a context of a negative budget or a budget deficit, or such huge budget deficits of 10% of GDP that we're running, I think that is an indication of a very negative contribution. We should also bear in mind that we are in a situation where we haven't seen growth for the last 7, 8 years. We haven't seen growth in this economy. And in that context, basically it is hard to understand how you would get major contributions from migrants. It means that there's little growth, there's growing unemployment in the last few years because of all the layoffs, all the COVID phenomena and so forth. In that kind of context, I think Venezuelan migrants may displace local employees, and in that context, you can't get a negative, a net positive contribution. So that because the unemployed, the Trinidadians who would lose jobs to Venezuelans, they would not be able to contribute to national revenue. So my feeling is that the context is not the same as when we started. When we started 3 years ago, it was not like that, but things have deteriorated somewhat, and to some extent, we need to take that into account. To be brief and to try to leave some time for discussion, let me just say that the characteristics of the migrants are very important in discussing this. Roger mentioned the question of skill. If we get skilled migrants, then the contribution to the national fiscal, national treasury would be much greater than if we get unskilled migrants. From the surveys that I have seen done by the UN, I believe that there are more unskilled migrants here than there are skilled migrants, so that you tend to feel that the contribution would be much less in that context than if we had skilled migrants. I think we also, Roger makes a point, a very valid point about the age structure of the migrants. I think he's correct in the sense that we have a much younger population, and there's what he calls a demographic dividend to be drawn. This will be drawn, of course, over time, to the extent that they stay here and they participate in the labor market and so forth, and we give them, the point he makes about the labor market is very important, the extent to which we allow them to actively participate in the labor market over time so they can make a contribution that to some extent would help. So that most of this is really a kind of work in progress. I think we have to, in a way, begin to continue to monitor the situation and begin to see really how we could guide this situation through policy over time to allow a much greater integration and participation of the Venezuelan migrant community. We want to be able to put them in a better position so they can make a contribution to the national treasury. And once the economy starts to expand, if we could get the economy to expand and we could absorb more of Venezuelan labor market, I think that is quite possible over time. As I said, we don't have very clear results. I'm not in a position to really tell you clearly whether the contribution is positive or negative. But what you basically see that over time in most countries, if they adopt proper policies, you can get that kind of positive contribution coming out as they integrate more in the particular country. But let me leave it at that at this point, and we'll participate in the discussion and try to clarify some of these issues. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez, for your contribution. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Tiwari to give his contribution. Dr. Tiwari. Okay, Dr. Tiwari, we'd just like you to unmute your microphone, please.
All right, are you hearing now?
Yes, we're hearing you now.
All right.
Okay. Oh, we're not seeing you, just in case you were wondering. Okay, so we're seeing you now, but we're not hearing you.
How's that?
Okay, so we can hear you now and see you. Lovely.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
All right, Chancellor, good evening, everybody. I enjoyed the presentation by Roger Hussein and Anthony Gonzalez, the commentary on it. And I think Roger really very calmly made a good case. I do agree with the argument that he is making that the Venezuelans here could in fact yield a demographic dividend. All the research about immigration almost everywhere shows that while there is an initial fiscal burden on the country, the host country, or while certain stresses are brought to the country, in the long term, the immigration is good for the host country. And I think in this case, in Trinidad and Tobago, where Dr. Hussein is arguing this case, he's really making the point that they will actually reduce the fiscal burden. They will not just complement, but in a way, in a fundamental way, supplement the aging local population. And given what might be the structure of education and intellectual capital and so on in the community, it could play a significant role in growing the economy. He makes the distinction, of course, between tradable goods and non-tradable goods, something he has persisted on throughout these seminars that we've had here. And I think he's finally brought it together in a very, very impactful and well-argued way, making the case that where you deploy your immigrant population is going to make a very big difference. He argues the case for now being an opportunity to recalibrate and restructure the economy in the direction of non-energy exports, building on that argument of where you put your immigrants in tradables or non-tradables. And he talks about the low participation rates, and he makes the point that if we had a dramatic shift in labor participation by 15 or 20%, that also could make a decisive contribution to development and make a decisive difference. So I find the arguments and the position taken by Dr. Hussein very palatable. I can receive them in a way that makes me comfortable. But I just want to mention a few things about the host economy and the disposition. That's to say, Trinidad and Tobago as a host economy and the disposition that is critical to not just recognize what Dr. Hussein is saying, but I mean, for a country to be serious about this thing, they have to be serious about development strategy. And therefore, the development strategy of the government and the country, Trinidad and Tobago, comes into focus because of this. And I want to say that, I mean, going forward from here, especially in this COVID time, and people are beginning, thoughtful people and knowledgeable people in the health sector are wondering if we are ever going to have a post-COVID era, because they feel that somehow we're going to have to find a way of living with this thing, maybe not 1 year, 2 years, but maybe for a decade. And there's a lot of scenario planning that is going on because of that. And I think it is something that we should bear in mind, that when we talk about the post-COVID economy, we have to be careful. But there are certain things that are not going to go away. anytime soon. One is the issue of climate change. I won't go into examples of that because I don't want to speak about these things. The other thing is the principle of sustainable development and the elements of that. The third issue is the issue of inclusion, which has now become very dramatic because of COVID. The fourth issue is competitiveness, of course, a different kind of competitiveness. The fifth issue is innovation. If you want to have sustainable development, you've got to have perpetual innovation. And the sixth issue is equity, because the world is becoming more and more unequal. The Western Hemisphere is the most unequal region in the world. We have an explosion in South Africa recently. Whatever the causes or the promptings, South Africa is the most unequal society on the face of the earth. And the inequities in society are becoming stark. So these things, these six things that I'm mentioning here: climate change, sustainable development, inclusion, competitiveness, innovation, and equity, or inequity, if you want to deal with it that way, are going to be dominant concerns as we go forward. All right. So the development strategy you have locally has to take these things into account. And you cannot ignore an immigrant population of 60,000 people, even if you say only 15,000 are registered. One of the comments I made recently was when the Minister of Finance came to present his mid-year budget. I mean, it was as if there were no Venezuelans here. The issue of immigrants did not arise in the entire debate by any member of parliament. And I could not believe that that was not a factor in either the economy or the polity of the country. And so the second thing is not just we've got to, we have to bring into focus the development strategy of the government in that context that I'm talking to you about. But the government's commitment to restructuring also comes into focus. And there are some important salient points, some of which are very well known to us, which is, are we going to focus on the energy sector or the non-energy and renewables? I mean, that is a fundamental question that we have a lot of talk about, but that matter is not settled, it's not resolved. Okay? The second issue is, are we going to focus on the existing manufacturing and services sector? Or are we going to focus on a new manufacturing and services sector of a different type? Or are we going to try somehow to nurture and develop both? And that also is a discussion point that is absent. The third issue is that we have a confidence problem in the country. We have an investment situation in which we have no investment really. We have negative investment in Trinidad and Tobago. Our people are investing outside and money is going on. And we have to address the issue of investment and the diversification of investment, diversification in a broad sense. We have to address the issue of restructuring, not just from energy alone, but from the old services and the old manufacturing. We have to also address the issue of diversification of markets as we seek to advance exports, and we have to address value chain issues. Now, all of these are critical factors that impact on confidence and the labor market and the labor pool. And if we were to resolve some of these questions by policy and action, it could help us in managing this immigration presence of Venezuelans in our country. We've got to address this issue of balance of trade and balance of payments, because that is what is going to allow us to see that we've got not just to increase the pool of our labor into things like agriculture and import substitution and export-oriented manufacturing and services, but that we've got to also deploy the Venezuelans in this. So I am making the case that an emphasis on decision making in strategic areas is critical for making sense of the opportunities that Venezuelan immigrants present. And then there's the issue of agriculture and food security and import substitution. When Ms. Mengo was here and she spoke with us and she gave us her view of what was happening with the Venezuelans, she said that many of the Venezuelans actually liked agriculture and they don't mind working in agriculture. And I have a friend who is involved in tilapia farming and doing very, very well. And I mean, several of his employees are in fact Venezuelans who work long hours and who do good work, and they help him with the development of his agricultural enterprise. And we've got to come to some realities about our local condition. So for instance, the Minister of Finance cannot come and tell us that we have, $5.6 billion in the HSF and $7 billion in the foreign reserves, etc., without explaining to us that we have $130 billion in debt and that we have a balance of payments problem and a balance of trade issue. And that balance of payments problem, if we don't do something about it, will wipe out the foreign reserves. And the debt, as it goes higher and higher, makes the HSF irrelevant. Because as I was talking to another one of our colleagues who have contributed here, and we were having a public discussion, Marlene Arts, I was saying, if you have $5 in your pocket, but you have $15 in debt, you don't have $5. You really owe $10. And that is the problem with the HSF and debt. I would think the government is doing nothing about the labor market issues. They are pretending that it's not there. We don't have any up-to-date figures on unemployment or anything. I mean, I understand the COVID situation. I know it's dire. I know it has created extra problems. But we are not addressing those issues at all. But if we had the Venezuelans in the labor market and we had increased participation, as Roger is suggesting that we might, it may well begin, we may then be able to see a way of dealing with NIS and pension issues and productivity issues and some entrepreneurship issues. And ultimately, I mean, Venezuela is not going to be like it is forever. Some increased trade between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. And we must always think of Venezuela, that eastern seaboard of Venezuela that is facing us when we look from the Gulf. And there's a whole population of people there and a whole capacity for development that we have not begun to even think about. In policy terms, the government of Trinidad and Tobago needs to make a serious link between knowledge on the one side, that is to say research and the knowledge that it produces for application, and intellectual capital on the other, that is to say the number of graduates coming out of the university system, the tertiary system, and its implications for entrepreneurship, new investment, competitiveness, and innovation. And the value of new intellectual capital coming from the Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, and what a mix of this can do. I will give one example of knowledge. I was speaking to Professor Umaharan the other day, and he was telling me that we once had the premier export position for anthuriums in this country. But we lost it. I wouldn't go into that now. And we have never been able to recover it. And now other countries have taken that over. We also have the knowledge for that. We have the intellectual property assets of being able to produce every color of anthurium under the sun, from black to white and everything in between. And, you know, if there was serious entrepreneurs in that, instead of looking at agriculture only as import substitution, we could also have export potential. And we have a number of things that we've been able to identify over the last 3 or 4 weeks, in which in the agricultural sector, we can not only import substitute, but we can actually export. So that here is an opportunity again, in which the presence of the Venezuelans can be valuable, but we've got to take some decisions here, because our intellectual capital is simply migrating. Our knowledge is simply sitting in the university and in the heads of academics. And the Venezuelans who are present, they're doing any job they can find, because we're not making any assessment of their value in order to deploy them properly. So we are making mistakes all around. And then finally, we are living through this COVID pandemic now, trying to go back to the old economy and recover. I have said over and over again, and I will continue to say it, who wants to hear will hear, who don't want to listen, I imagine they will put us all in a bigger mess than we are now. But the old economy cannot get us out of this mess. There is no chance of it. They didn't grow the old economy since 2015, not one iota. It was not grown, it was not possible. So there is no way that that economy is going to get us to recovery. So we have to start and accelerate the creation of a new economy. And I don't see any decisions nationally that are suggesting that we are even thinking of that. As I said, the investment over the last few years have been all negative, and we are not getting investments. And I don't see any strategy, I don't see any articulation that would suggest that we are doing anything other than going to the old economy. Whether that old economy is construction, manufacturing, services, food, which is really the retail industry, dependent on a lot of imports because it's not tied to the agriculture sector here. And I'm not seeing any articulation about that. And then finally, the collapse of business in the country because of COVID means that there are a lot of entrepreneurs who can't restart their businesses anymore. But if directed properly, if the knowledge sector, government sector, the private sector could come together, some of their know-how and their capacity already gained in other businesses could be redirected in areas in which they can invest, that is export-oriented, creating jobs, not just for Trinidadians, but possibly for Venezuelans as well. And I want to close by talking about the financial situation in terms of immigration, because in immigration, in this kind of immigration here that we have, if you want to solve the problem, you have to fix Venezuela, you have to fix the host countries that are absorbing the immigrants. And in a fundamental way, you have to fix the system. Because I said already that the Western Hemisphere is the most unequal hemisphere in the world. All the countries have an inequality problem, and that includes, by the way, the United States. And in that kind of scenario, not only Venezuela has to be helped, but every country has to be helped. And Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, absorbing 60,000 and pretending it is 12,500. It doesn't make sense, because you are carrying this burden alone when you should not be. And Trinidad and Tobago, as far as I know, has accepted no money from outside. The other day, the European Union said that they had given Trinidad and Tobago some money. There was a report in the paper, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs got up and said that they had got none, that they didn't take any money from them. The US aid said that they had given them about $4 million a little while ago in 2020. They said, no, we didn't get that at all. They didn't get that. The World Bank was offering financing, and Colombia got $31.5 million from the World Bank. Trinidad and Tobago could have applied for it because they were in the same position as Colombia. They never applied. They did not get. The Inter-American Development Bank has $100 million. The representative of the Inter-American Development Bank was here on this forum and said that he had $100 million and $800 million more in concessional loans to go with the free money. But Trinidad and Tobago has not asked for any of those. And when you look at the research of the Brookings Institute, they tell us that the Syrian crisis, which had about 7.5 million people, cost about $20 billion, $20.8 billion, or $3,150 per refugee or per immigrant. In South Sudan, which is much smaller than the Venezuelan immigration, which is almost 6 million, it costs per refugee about it costs about $11,000 per actual refugee, and a significant amount of money, $3.2 billion. In the case of the Venezuelan refugee, it is costing about $265 per refugee, and only $2 billion have been made available for this. So we have a twin problem here. Trinidad and Tobago, who will accept money from nobody for the Venezuelans here, are not talking the truth about how many Venezuelans are actually here, and claiming it is only 12.5 thousand people here in Trinidad and Tobago, much less than the actual numbers. And they will not accept any money from anybody. Then you have a situation where the world and the financial system of the world system is not providing enough money for the Venezuelan migration, which consists of refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people, immigrants. It is not providing enough. So again, that is something that we've got to begin to address in the hemisphere. I will not address the bigger issue of hemispheric imbalance in individual countries. But the point I want to make is that I want to close with this summary point, which is that I buy and support the argument that Dr. Hussein is making. I think that the argument that he's making is dependent on government policy and decision making on a number of fundamental national policy issues that have to do with economics and finance and development strategy. I think that Trinidad and Tobago needs to make up its mind about how it's going to deal with the financial system in order to support the Venezuelans here. And fourthly, I think the world has to come to terms with the fact that this is a major crisis in the world, the second largest exodus of people from a country in the history of the world after the Syrian exodus. And therefore, they must also come to terms with that fact and play their role. And at that point, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. T.Y., for your contribution. Okay, everyone. So now we turn our attention to the chat, and we would like to bring out some questions from the audience. I have a few of my own, but I will ask. Just one moment. All right, yes, but I'll bring out first a question by. Sorry, just getting a question. Hari Haran Sinatharaman. Dr. Hussein? I didn't. If you.
My question is Professor.
Ah, okay. No problem. Yes. All right. So I'll just ask the question. Thanks. Is it fair to say that the estimated per capita expenditure for both national security as well as healthcare is a bit inflated in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, with poor and inefficient resource allocation, so as to derive the maximum impact and or benefit to the population and by extension the common man? So I'll just put this question to our panel.
Yeah. So let me respond to that. Thanks for the question, Prof. Now, first to begin, this is the dilemma we find ourselves in. This conversation here was perhaps as best at this point in time, just an intelligent conversation with some numbers. Just moving the ball, getting people interested in this conversation, because when you search for information, whereas for trade, I can make some really good deductions and some really good estimations, whereas for calculation of immigrant surplus, I could make some fine-tuned numbers that I have confidence in. For the fiscal cost, I am intelligently guessing. Now, it's not something that we want to do at all, but there is no data, and there is no well-established data set in terms of whether or not the healthcare cost per capita of the Venezuelan immigrants here is inflated. What I would say is that I spoke to several very senior people that work in the public and private healthcare sector, and using the base percentages that they gave me and the sectors in which the Venezuelans access, that's the number we came up with. What I would say, it is very possible that this number is inflated. I won't dispute that, and somebody like Professor Hariaran would be able to, would probably even know more than most people in the world about these type of numbers. So I would be welcome and open to his comment. In terms of national security though, I am going to guess that it's the opposite. I am going to guess that the numbers are not inflated, but could even be an underestimation of the actual cost. And I say that because, and I have Venezuelan tenants, and I think that some of them for 3 years, some for 2 years, some for 1 year, they come and go and whatnot. I think I have seen police intervene in their affairs in a way greater than the national average, or what I would call the neighbors in the same area in which the house that I rented them is located. So that I don't think we should underestimate their use of national security services. But again, I have no hard data. I'm only going by that type of observation. I live not too far from the police station. I often pass in front of the police station when I'm coming home. And I often see Venezuelans at the police station. Of course, I don't know what they are just there for. They could just be going to say hello. They could just be going to chop an empanada. I don't know. But I have said that I have the gut feeling based upon my involvement with them and my casual observation that maybe the national security is an undervaluation, whilst I'm open to the comments on the healthcare cost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, as I read the question, it seems to be suggesting that because of the inefficiencies in these sectors, the per capita expenditure is relatively inflated, and I think that seems to be my interpretation of it. Now, I have not studied these two sectors in any depth. It's very difficult to sort of assess where these inefficiencies are. We do find that national security costs has been rising significantly over the last how many years and so on, and yet we have not been seeing the results that we had expected. I mean, it's only last year we began to see some decline in the crime, but you still have a very serious crime situation on your hand, and a number of other areas where border control and stuff like that, where we're still having very serious problems. We're still trying to deal with some of these issues. So I really can't. I'm not in a position in a way to really sort of assess these inefficiencies and see to what extent that cost could be reduced. So like Roger, in a sense, I'd be guessing here. I do suspect that we may have some inefficiencies. We hear, for example, about the cost of drugs, the misallocation of drugs in the public health system, and all the complaints we get every day about the public health system. It's very, again, difficult to assess this. We know that there are a fair amount of inefficiencies, but to really pinpoint them and to really say how that cost could be reduced, or whether the cost is not inflated to Venezuelans is another matter. So I really can't answer this with any degree of precision. It's not something that I've ever studied. All that is done here is to take these figures from the national budget and to divide them by the population, and you get an average figure. And it's a kind of nominal figure. It's not really an effective figure in terms of cost efficiency and proper allocation of resources. So that's basically what I would say on this.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. Okay, Dr. Tiwari, you wanted to comment on it?
Not really. I have no way of assessing. I have no numbers, and I have no observation evidence or hearsay evidence. I really don't know what the situation is, but my own feeling is that well, based on the things that I've read from both Dr. Hussein and Dr. Gonzalez, who both of them have dealt with some of these matters in the pieces that they wrote. I have no way of refuting the positions that they take on it. I would have to I would have to go with their assessment of it because I don't have any evidence.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tuari. Okay, I have one question for the panel. After the energy sector, most of the largest businesses in the country tend to import goods and sell to the local market. So my question is, given that we need growth in export-related areas like manufacturing and perhaps also in agriculture, is there some way or what economic incentives can we put in place to encourage those large businesses away from activities that absorb significant amounts of foreign exchange and to get them into those export-related activities? So that's my question. Because in my thinking, these are the firms that have the most amounts of capital, and they also have, if there's a shortage of foreign exchange, they also would tend to have a lot to lose.
Yeah. Yes, Christian, let me say that you're talking about fundamental restructuring here. To get businesses that were importing and selling to the domestic market to go into the export market require a significant change in mentality as well as the profitability of business. For instance, if right now the risk return in distribution and in the non-tradable sector is such that it allows people to remain comfortable in there and do just as good or as better as those who export. So what you're trying to do is to really shift the rate of profitability to the tradable sector, to the export sector, to the import competing sector in such a way that it will be very difficult for people to make a profit in the non-tradable sector, the distribution sector. And the way to do that is basically through taxation, through incentives, through tariffs, through various instruments, tax credits, and so forth. And I even mentioned when I talk about devaluation, I look at devaluation as a way of doing that. It's not an instrument that I would hold on to any extent, but initially it could provide us with a shock to be able to do that, because then important goods would become a lot more expensive, and the profitability there will seriously decline. And people would see easier that if the exchange rate changes in such a way that when you change a US dollar, you get more local dollars, then there's more incentive for you to go in that direction. But I would also say that exporting is tough business, especially if we're exporting outside of CARICOM. You would see where, for example, most of our firms, they tend to remain within CARICOM because they're more comfortable there and they're also behind the protective wall of CARICOM. We do have a common external tariff that provides some degree of protection to our firms. Going beyond CARICOM is a challenge because you have to compete with the outside world, and there you require to bring your costs to a very, very competitive level to be able to survive. Penetrating markets is a very costly thing. It requires some kind of a significant, what you might call marketing economies of scale. You must have a certain amount of scale to do that, to go into supermarkets abroad and stuff like that. So that exporting is tough business, and in a way, your firms have to come into that in such a more or less for the long haul. They have to grow themselves into that. We have roughly about 400 firms in this country that export. Most of them, as I said, mainly to CARICOM, which is a good start. It's better than most other countries in the region. And some of them now, because of the situation in CARICOM, they are forced to look outside of CARICOM. And that's an opportunity for them to really open up new markets. And the pity we are faced with this COVID situation. But as we get out of that, I'm hoping that you will be able to take advantage of the opportunities. Now, we have significant trade agreements with the countries in Latin America, in North America, as well as in Europe. And we haven't taken full advantage of these trade agreements. It requires a certain kind of infrastructure to get these agreements working. We need to have trade attaches, trade representatives in these countries. We need to pay more attention to how we penetrate those markets and so forth. It's just quite a bit of work. And this is why, for example, when I first started in this particular area as a young lecturer, I always used to speak about using foreign investment. And I had always talked about that, and it's still, for example, something we need to think about, which is that for a small country, foreign investment reduces the cost of marketing abroad, of penetrating export markets. Lewis, when he talks about learning the tricks of the trade over time, he's basically saying, well, you know, we have to use the export channels of the foreign investor, which is something that Singapore used very, very well, because Singapore, so when it first started out, and they didn't really have the tricks of the trade, that the foreign investors were the ones who had the markets abroad, and they had to use them. Now, we have used them to some extent with respect to the energy sector, those big companies we know which are involved with these huge integrated markets, which are vertically integrated. That is, if you're in one particular sector, in the basic sector of producing aluminium, you have the aluminium market, producing bauxite, you have the aluminium market tied up, and so they have everything integrated. So, but we have to also see them in terms of wider manufacturing, that they're involved in a lot of things. It's just like tourism in a sense. It's hard for you to be successful in tourism unless you're able to penetrate that vertically integrated market, which is to say the tour operators, the hotel owners, and the airlines. You have to work with them in some way to be able to get us a part of that pie. So we have never seen it that way. We have focused largely on local manufacturing in the domestic market and in the CARICOM market, but we have not seen it as really being driven to go beyond CARICOM into the extra regional market. So there's a lot to talk about here. We don't have really the time to really talk about it, but I think it's in addition to the incentives, we also need a kind of marketing strategy that would involve joint ventures, foreign investment, various kinds of arrangements with foreigners that would allow us to be able to do this.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. Dr. Tiwari, do you?
If I may add some, oh sorry.
Dr. Hussain, yeah?
No, let Dr. Tiwari go first.
Dr. Tiwari, okay.
Yeah, a couple of things. I don't have much to say. I would say that the way I see it now is that instead of just looking at the structure of the economic participation as you did in terms of who owns business and how is this deployed in the country and whether they import and export, etc. I think that the more I think about it now and the more I kind of understand some things that I didn't quite understand in the same way before. I think the first thing we need to do is to see what the knowledge sector is providing. I mean, I have spoken to 4 academics at several of them, but 4 academics at the university who are engaged in serious research. And among them, I have identified in my mind 6 opportunities for investments. And I'm going to bring them to the public space. But what that means is that you take the knowledge and you identify how it can be applied and what the projects might be, but you still have to have an entrepreneur that would be willing to go into that and take the risk. So the question is how you get from knowledge and applications and projects to investment and the sustainability of that investment. So I think that is one issue. I think the second issue is that if we have produced for the last decade and a half about 5,000 graduates from the tertiary system, if you take 15 years, you're talking about 75,000 people with a minimum of a first degree. Some of them have masters, a handful of them might have PhDs. And it seems to me that that is a significant base of intellectual capital on which to build investment and industry. So that would be the second area that I would look at. All right. The third area is that I would look at the blue economy, that's to say the Caribbean Sea around us. And there are many, many opportunities there. But out of my conversation with that particular academic, marine scientist from the University of the West Indies, Judith Gobin, we were able to identify at least 2 projects that are very viable and doable, and that can be an investment and make money, foreign exchange, in Trinidad and Tobago. The fourth thing is that I think it would be foolish for us to think that we could build a viable economy here without foreign investment. The only reason we built an oil and energy and natural gas industry and all these spin-off industries from that is because we had foreign investment. And it's the same thing if we are going to diversify the rest of the economy and away from energy. You are going to need local capital. You're going to need local intellectual capital. You are going to need local knowledge capital, but you're also going to need foreign investment. And I want to take the point that Dr. Gonzalez just made, deriving from Arthur Lewis, which is one of the things that foreign investors bring to you is they come with a market. Because when they come to invest here, they know where they're going to sell it. So that's the other thing. And the final thing I want to mention is import substitution and how it works. You know, most of the lettuce in KFC and so on comes from outside. You know, a significant amount of the tomatoes in the sandwich comes from outside. So we've got to find those linkages. And one of the problems with the linkages is that the farmers cannot supply reliably the quantities that are required. You understand? And part of the reason for that are things like flood and drought and disease and so on. But I was speaking to Professor Sarvan Kumar in the Department of Agriculture at UB, and he has been able to develop a disease-resistant tomato that can be planted free of disease, and you do not need pesticides for them. It has to do with 2 elements. It's a grafting component. That's the first thing that makes them more resistant. And the second thing is there are chemicals that derive out of natural things that are not chemicals really, whatever you call them, that they use that can keep the plants going and nutritious, etc. The second thing is that he has also done that for certain types of peppers and certain types of lettuce. So at least for home consumption, local consumption, and for supplying places that need them in large quantities to sell sandwiches or whatever it is, you can do that. But that is not all. There are other people that are involved here who have developed very high technologies using using knowledge from India, using knowledge from Israel, using knowledge from Canada. They have been able to develop systems in which you have high productivity plants. And out of that, you can get yields of, let's say, 10 acres in, half an acre in the kind of strategic use of the agriculture that you can, so that you can do a lot of things. And these include local as well as foreign import substitution type fruits that you can grow under any temperature. So I believe that this is the era in which we have to focus on knowledge, on intellectual capital. We have to focus on technology. We have to make better use of science, and we have to find a way of transferring that to the system. And we also need to have very creative financing arrangements as well. And that is where some of the businesses that you are talking about can become involved. They may not want to go into agriculture, but they could finance somebody in agriculture. And through angel investing or venture capital investing, or take a silent equity share into the investment, etc., and build it. You could build the market. There's no reason why the owners of KFC, for instance, could not support some farmers, take a small equity stake in it, and let the farmers supply them with all the things that they want. And, you know, that way there is a direct, so there are creative things. And I am telling you, if we don't start, you know, thinking outside the box now and trying to do some serious things like these, you know, you might as well pack up and call it Georgian.
Thank you very much,
I would
Dr.
just add one thing
Tiwari.
to what Prof. Gonzalez and Dr. Tiwari said, and I would also use it as my closing comment. Before we do most of these things, we need to register the migrants. We need to have a basic understanding of the numbers and allow these people to walk from where they are staying to a place of work without being worried about being arrested by the police and being harassed by in different ways. And it's tough that we have been calling on the state for so long to make these basic interventions, to change the way we integrate the migrants into the community, which would have influenced their sense of productivity, their sense of interaction, the ease of communication in so many different ways. And it's not expensive to register them. As we showed with the numbers, and Professor Gonzalez also elaborated, the cost of registering them was about, if I remember correctly, $179 per person. Let's do it, and let's get the ball moving, because our economy is in a precarious position. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. So now I'd just like to invite Professor Gonzalez first, and then Dr. Tiwari to give their closing remarks. Professor Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you, Christian. Well, as I said in my earlier presentation, we're still ready to finally discover what the fiscal costs of migrants here involve. It's a work in progress. As I noted, from all the work that I have seen, over the long term, that is to say over a decade, migration can be made to work in your favor if you go about it in the proper way. Trinidad has a lot of scope for development. We're in a period now where things have been tough, but it's like every other country, things are rough. Before COVID, we also had difficulties in the sense that the economy was not growing. But I think if we mobilize all the forces around us, we can see possibilities in the future in which the Venezuelan migrants can play a very positive role. We have noted, or in the discussion we have had so far tonight, I think it's clear that the cost may not really be that high. It's not something that we cannot afford. And there are benefits which we haven't mentioned that could come, not only in terms of their tax contribution, but also in terms of their contribution to export development and to business development as a whole. There are a lot of other areas here which we haven't looked at. So if you take the wider social benefits of having Venezuelans here, which could be very positive over the long term, we can try to exploit these advantages to help us go into that new trajectory that you were talking about, Christian, which is to say developing that non-energy export sector and so forth. I think it's very opportune that you have this Venezuelan exodus at this point in time, because we need to penetrate foreign markets. And this is an opportune moment to try to do that by integrating them into the market and working with them. And we can, in a way, help boost that, that export strategy that we need to put in place and promote in the next decade. So basically, this is what I see it. I think I said to see it in that kind of positive way. It's not something that has overwhelmed us in the sense that, you know, we have migrants sleeping on the street, or we see them really suffering and with all sorts of problems that of security and so forth. We have not reached that stage with migrants as yet. And I think so far, you know, things appear to me to be relatively manageable. So in that sense, I look forward as we come out of COVID, for us being able to guide, set up the proper policies to be able to take us along the kind of trajectory that I think we need to go on, and which in fact, I think we all have some kind of interest in.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. Dr. Tiwari?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. For a region of the world that migrates almost everywhere, and that has a large proportion of its population as immigrants in North America and England and different parts of Europe, I think we should be much more accommodating to the reality of Venezuelan immigrants here in Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed in the whole Caribbean. And secondly, we should not look at the Venezuelans as a cause for blame, and we should look inward and see all the very unnecessary things that we are doing to cause our own underdevelopment, and try to strategically focus on the things that we must do to have a serious development agenda for Trinidad and Tobago and the region. And on the basis of that, see how the Venezuelans can strategically fit and play a role in the development of this part of the world, and open up the doors to trade and investment in Venezuela and other maybe Latin American countries as well, because we've got to begin to move outward. Some of the big companies are already doing that, and Trinidad and Tobago, in order to survive in the world, has to do that. So I would see this as an opportunity, and I would take the necessary wise steps to turn that opportunity into something of value.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. So everyone, that brings us to the end of this evening's session. We just want to thank our panelists, Dr. Hussein, Professor Gonzalez, and Dr. Tiwari for taking the time to join us, and in particular, you, our audience, for joining us this evening. So thank you very much. Everyone stay safe, and I wish you all the best and a great weekend. Take care, everyone.